And there was a small poster. It was during the time of the Japanese kind of occupation of the Philippines. And that poster said, Asia for Asiatics, implying that what Japan was doing in World War II was simply defending Asia, throwing out the Western colonial powers. And so that's, again, it struck me when I heard some of the rhetoric coming out of China, that really what China wants is, let's get rid of these old vestiges of post-World War II security order in Asia. Instead, let's have Asia defend Asians.
That's just one of the many stories coming up on Asia News Weekly, a digest of some of the biggest stories in the Asia-Pacific region. You can download all of our shows on iTunes, Stitcher, and TuneIn Radio. And if you enjoy this episode, we'll hope that you'll share it with your friends and subscribe so you won't miss the next one. The US and China. Japan struggles with selling self-defense, and Thailand makes progress. These stories and more on the July 18th edition of Asia News Weekly. Welcome to Asia News Weekly. I'm your host, Steve Miller. Our first story this week is from China. Last week, U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry and U.S. Defense Secretary Chuck Hagel traveled to Beijing. The meetings were an attempt to gain ground on a lot of common issues like trade, North Korea, and in order to lessen tensions around the Chinese territorial disputes and accusations of state-sponsored cyber attacks. U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry said last Thursday that Washington and Beijing agreed on important urgency of swiftly curbing North Korea's nuclear weapons program, adding that they discussed specific ways to advance the goal of denuclearizing North Korea. Quote, China shares the same strategic goal, and we discussed the importance of enforcing UN Security Council resolutions that impose sanctions on North Korea's weapons of mass destruction and ballistic missiles program. Kerry said China must play its, quote, unique role in persuading North Korea to give up its nuclear program and rein in its unruly ally. President Xi's recent trip to South Korea might be a sign he's willing to do more, but truthfully, no one is making any headway on North Korea. North Korea continues to defy firing even more missiles with no ramifications. When it comes to North Korea, all members of the six-party talks are falling short at reining in Kim Jong-un. If Kerry truly wants China to do more on North Korea, then he should step forward himself and commit the United States to take a harder line. North Korea knows that all the saber-rattling that they do won't garnish any significant problems. As I mentioned, the discussion also turned to cyber terrorism. In May, the United States indicted 5 Chinese officials for allegedly hacking into U.S. companies to steal trade secrets. Kerry said China's cyber espionage activities, quote, have harmed our businesses and threatened our nation's competitiveness, end quote. China, of course, disputes this, but even as Kerry was there, new incursions were detected. According to the Department of Homeland Security, the agency's National Cybersecurity and Communications Integration Center became aware of potential intrusion to their network. The intrusion at the Office of Personnel Management was particularly disturbing because it oversees a system called Electronic Questionnaires for Investigations Processing, or EQIP, in which federal employees applying for security clearances enter the most personal information. Also, federal employees who have already had security clearances performed are often required to update their information through the website. The attack was notable because while hackers have often tried to breach United States government servers, they rarely succeed. Chinese State Counselor Yang Jiechi said cybersecurity was a common threat and a challenge facing all countries. Cyberspace should not become a tool for damaging the interests of other countries. And that statement is true. The United States isn't the only target of Chinese hackers. Japan has seen an uptick in irregular access to government computer systems and cyber attacks. Trying to bolster cybersecurity and preparing for the 2020 Olympics, Yasuhiko Taniwaki, Deputy Director General for the government's National Information Security Center, said, the rise in cyber attacks in the last year was largely in line with the global trend and was not specific to Japan. Attacks by Chinese people, or people who understood Chinese, were on the rise. Seeing how things may play out on the global stage is Curtis S. Chin, a former U.S. ambassador to the Asian Development Bank.
Just look at the headlines today. China is rising, which actually I think is something that should be welcomed. But I think as in 70, 80 years ago, almost roles have changed. 70, 80 years ago, people worried about adjusted to the rise of Japan. And look at today, we see the rise of China. And so what I am saying is that that can be a good thing. But I think all of us need to be wary, including China, that China's rise, both economically and militarily, doesn't unintentionally lead us all down to the path of conflict and indeed armed conflict.
Overall, many countries don't support China's claim. Do you think that they'll have to back down, or China will come to the middle in some way?
I think the reality is that money talks and force talks. Back down, is, for Asia, it sounds like then someone is losing face. I think China, if it's smart, if the region is smart, all nations will come together and find some kind of face-saving way forward to avoid conflict. But I think China has been very clear that it's not afraid of conflict, even armed conflict, when it feels people are threatening its sovereignty. And there was a small poster, it was during the time of the Japanese kind of occupation of the Philippines, and that poster said, Asia for Asiatics, implying that what Japan was doing in World War II was simply defending Asia, throwing out the Western colonial powers. And so that's, again, it struck me when I heard some of the rhetoric coming out of China, that really what China wants is, let's get rid of these old vestiges of post-World War II security order in Asia. Instead, let's have Asia defend Asians.
You can hear my complete conversation with Curtis Chin on Monday's Asia Now podcast. China is showing no signs of backing down, and really no one is stepping up to curb their behavior. It's often said that history repeats itself, and I wonder if that might be the case here. 11 countries bordering China feel there's essentially a 50-50 chance of armed conflict. Vietnam, South Korea, and Japan put it at about 85%, while the Philippines put it at 93%. My question to you is this: is the United States being too cautious with Xi? I can't wait to hear your thoughts, so please leave them in the comments on Facebook or Twitter. In just a few minutes, an update on the Indonesian elections. Just about 3 weeks ago on July 1st, Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe was able to get his cabinet to reinterpret Article 9 of Japan's constitution. This, of course, is the article that has prevented Japan from exercising its right to collective self-defense. Most regional partners in the area were in support of Japan expanding its military role. However, China and the Republic of Korea condemned the move. It also wasn't a very popular decision at home, with over half of the population opposing the cabinet's ruling, with over half of Japan expressing opposing viewpoints. In fact, the Japanese cabinet approval rating has dropped to only 45.2%. The issue is now currently sitting in the Diet for final approval. This is despite opposition protests taking place daily outside the offices. Every nation has the right to collective self-defense. The Article 9 limits were imposed by the United States following World War II. Abe has said he just wants Japan to be a normal country, with the rights of every other nation. As I mentioned before, several countries are in support of this, namely the United States and Australia. Obviously, this is being done in response to China, which has unilaterally taken over most of the China Sea. It's also stepped up its confrontation over the Senkaku Daioh Islands. Most that voice opposition to the use of collective self-defense often voice concerns about putting troops in harm's way, or going to war. The truth is, Abe and his party have done a very poor job of explaining exactly what collective self-defense is and how it will be implemented. For example, Tokyo's Defense Minister Itsunori Onodera painted this picture. If a U.S. warship were sent to defend Japan, and those ships were attacked, the Japanese Constitution was interpreted to say that they could not help the Americans. In that instance, what is the purpose of having a, quote, self-defense force if you can't even help those that are defending you? And here are a few other misconceptions. One is that the role and mission of the SDF will fundamentally change, and the truth of the matter is that really isn't the case. There are significant limits on what the SDF can actually do. For example, the situation would have to pose a clear and present danger to Japan. There would have to be no other way to repel the attack, and the use of force would be limited to only what is minimally necessary. Another concern is that the Japanese military would then join foreign wars, and Abe himself has explicitly said that enabling collective self-defense would not lead to Japan's involvement in foreign wars. What's overlooked by critics is the language that focuses on protecting Japan and Japanese citizens. Because enabling collective self-defense would then enable Japan to fulfill its treaty obligations, many in South Korea are concerned that it would allow Japanese troops to set foot on the Korean peninsula. And that simply isn't the case. Repeatedly, Abe and the cabinet have said that the SDF will not be deployed to the Korean peninsula without the government's permission. China likes to point out that this decision destabilizes the region and endangers regional peace, but that's hardly the case. What is destabilizing the region is China's continued expansion. And the list goes on. Speaking at a World War II battlefield on Papua New Guinea, where 200,000 Japanese soldiers died, Abe said, "We must not repeat the horrors of war. I pledge in front of the spirits of the war dead that Japan wants to be a country that thinks about world peace with its friends in Asia and around the world." My question for you is this: what role do you see Japan's self-defense force playing in the future? Will it be one of regional strength or global? Links to all the stories in this week's episode can be found in the show notes at asiannewsweekly.net. While there, I will hope that you take a moment to leave your thoughts in the comment section, but also follow us on Facebook and Twitter to keep up to date with news as it happens. Indonesia is one of the world's largest democracies, and its citizens went to the polls last week to elect a new president. Some of the quick count or exit polls declared Jakarta Governor Joko Widodo as the winner. Some others declared Prabowo Subianto as the winner. I spoke with Jakarta Post senior editor Cornelius Purba to get a better understanding about how this could happen.
Since I think Indonesia has been familiar with pollsters since 2004, the last 10 years. Not just national elections, but also local elections, because they help us to know faster about the result of the elections. But also they are often used by the candidates, for instance, in the regions, also to boost their reputation, also to check the voters whether they like him or not, something like that. Also, and since 2004, 2009, and 2014. We can say all of the quick count results are very similar to the official counting by general elections commissions. So this is very helpful for us also to prevent, for instance, manipulations during the countings.
There was one report that the North Sumatra Election Supervisory Agency found a member of the sub-district polling committee tampering with ballots during the presidential election in Medan, North Sumatra. I asked if there were any significant signs of vote tampering.
So far, I think there are two pollsters, dubious, we call it dubious pollsters, because we suspect they were financed by, I think in this case, by the supporters of Prabowo. And because it is a bit strange, only two pollsters make a very different conclusion compared to others. 7 or 9 very credible surveyors.
I'd like to thank Cornelius Purba of the Jakarta Post for his time. Final election results are expected the first part of next week, and coming up later in the program, an update from Thailand. Left out of a key regional meeting between South Korea and China, North Korean leader Kim Jong-un continued his streak of acting out in an attempt to draw attention. As the 97,000-ton supercarrier, the USS George Washington, arrived in Busan last week to take part in naval drills just underway, North Korea released this warning, quote, "The U.S. should properly understand that the more persistently it resorts to reckless nuclear blackmail and threat, the further the DPRK will bolster up its cutting-edge nuclear force for self-defense, always ready to go into action," said North Korea's National Defense Commission. It then proceeded to fire more missiles 2 days later from just north of Kaesong into the East Sea or the Sea of Japan. These missiles are believed to be of the Scud variety, According to Seoul's Joint Chief of Staffs, quote, the North fired 2 short-range ballistic missiles, one at 1:20 a.m. and the other at 1:30 a.m. The projectiles are evaluated as having a range of some 300 kilometers. The missiles were launched from north of Kaesong, just 20 kilometers from the military demarcation line. It is very unusual for North to launch missiles from areas so close to the MDL. The official then went on to say that by launching missiles from Kaesong, North Korea wanted to show that it was capable of making surprise launches from any place, at any time. On Monday, July 14th, North Korea fired some 100 artillery shells from Kaesong. It's also near the DMZ, but over on the ECC of Japan side, the eastern border of the nation. Now, these shells were fired into the sea, but not south of the de facto maritime border referred to as the Northern Limit Line, or the NLL. South Korean Defense Ministry spokesman Kim Min-suk said, North Korea fired from a location very close to the demilitarized zone. It represents such a threat to South Korea that even our civilian tourists were able to witness columns of water triggered by North Korean shells landing in the sea. Kim also mentioned that if any of the shells would fall on the southern side of the NLL, South Korea would retaliate without hesitation. You see, the previous administration of Lee Myung-bak was perceived as being weak. When the shelling of Yeonpyeong Island and the sinking of the Cheonan happened, many in South Korea thought that the South's response was lacking, including myself. Since taking office, Park Geun-hye has said that any attack by North Korea would be met with a response of significant force. Taking all of this into consideration, one must keep in mind that all of North Korea's actions are just being done to garner attention and responses. The best course of action would be to simply stay vigilant and call the launches what they are: non-issues, not even worthy of an extensive response. Just one more bit of information about North Korea. With the arrival of the second half of the monsoon season, and we also have about a week's worth of rain forecast, the Joint Chiefs in Seoul reminded heavy rains often sweep North Korean landmines downstream into the south, where they can cause death or injury. The landmines come in wooden or plastic boxes, approximately 20 centimeters long, 9 centimeters wide, and 4.5 centimeters high. Each contains approximately 200 grams of explosive material equipped with a detonator set to go off upon opening, or in some cases, just shaking. The devices can cause injury to anyone within 2 meters. No mines have been found this year, but 258 mines have been found over the past 4. Looking at Kim Jong-un's control of the North, my question for you is this: how long do you think it will be before Kim Jong-un realizes that he no longer wields influence on the world stage? Will he sit idly by or lash out? Please, leave your thoughts in the comments. Asia Now comes your way every single Monday and Wednesday at 12:01 p.m., and it features stories and conversations taking place in the Asia-Pacific region. This week we changed things up just a little bit to highlight more interviews. On Monday's episode, we featured a behind-the-scenes interview with the creator of Seoul's only ghost tour.
Many of the places, we go right to them, and some of them still exist. And what's funny about it is the general public do not know that. And so they're right there at some of these places that have very dark histories with the exact same stones. And they have no idea what they're walking on top of.
Okay, a lot of this tour we're going to talk about the fall of the Chosun Dynasty and when the Japanese took over. Because it's a very dark, very violent, very political time. It's kind of like Game of Thrones in Asia.
Wednesday's show was also fascinating. We learned that from a disabled person's perspective, being in Japan was actually more advantageous than being in their own country.
It is an odd social convention. Put simply, if I go on a train and there's that little section, priority seats, I don't have to ask. I will simply stand near the seats and someone will ultimately get up. And that says a lot of good things about Japan, that people actually do obey the social conventions, that, yeah, these seats are meant for disabled people. But on the other hand, if my wife was with me, they wouldn't get up for her.
That's just a little sample of what you can expect in Asia Now, our second podcast. If you're only subscribed to Asia News Weekly, you're missing out on 2 extra shows every single week. Now, in the show notes, you'll find links to these 2 particular episodes. And if you go to iTunes or Stitcher or TuneIn Radio, you can, of course, subscribe to the Asia Now podcast feed. But if you want to get everything that we produce, subscribe to the Asia News Weekly All Shows feed. That way you'll get all the Asia Now podcasts, you'll get all the Asia News Weekly podcasts, and we are actually thinking about starting a new podcast. And of course, if you have the All Shows feed, you'll get everything in one place. On May 20th, General Prayut Chan-o-cha declared martial law in Thailand. It looked like a coup, smelled like a coup, and eventually became a coup on the 22nd. Since then, many questions have been asked about the direction the National Council for Peace and Order, or the NCPO, would take, especially since so many people were rounded up and detained, and while they were later released, a certain number of freedoms have been limited. So here's exactly what the NCPO is doing. First, a National Legislative Assembly consisting of about 200 members will act as parliament. It will then select a prime minister who will then, of course, set up a cabinet. The NCPO will remain in power and work in parallel with the government until a new constitution is announced. A 250-member National Reform Council will then be formed and look into all areas, including politics, economy, social, environment, energy, and the justice system. It's anticipated that this council will start sometime in October. This may be some sort of brokered agreement between Wisanu Krengam, a legal expert, and the junta, according to at least one unnamed source. Now, during this process, General Prayut said the government will perform the administrative roles of running the country, while the NCPO will handle security. However, do keep in mind that General Prayut still is the acting prime minister and in control of absolutely everything in Thailand. He also said that there would be occasional joint meetings between the NCPO and the newly formed interim government to review how things are being put into action, leaving me to question just how independent the panel will really be. If the NCPO is meeting with the interim government and Prayut controls the NCPO, is the new government, is the Reform Council really just a rubber stamp for Prayut? However, to the general's credit, he did call upon those with differing political views to be open to all possibilities, essentially asking everyone to walk a mile in the other's shoes. Quote, "If this cannot be done, there will be no going forward, even when reconciliatory songs are being played every day. If you don't open yourselves up, nothing can be fixed. How can everyone live together from now on?" That is very sage advice and exactly what needs to happen. But I have to ask you, do you believe it? Or is this just an attempt to go through the motions before extending his control? There's still widespread condemnation of the coup, and it might actually help things if Prayut puts someone else in control of overseeing the reforms. Maybe someone from the royal family, or perhaps someone designated by the king to oversee the constitutional revision. Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe has made 2 big political pushes this year. The first was to implement collective self-defense, and the second was to find out the fate of Japanese citizens it says were abducted by North Korea. This past week, there have been actually a few conflicting stories that have surfaced. First, it was reported that during a meeting in Beijing last week, North Korean officials were presented a list of 30 survivors along with their birth dates, occupations, and family members' names, including, quote, "several of the 17 people officially recognized as abductees by Tokyo," said the Nikkei Daily. The report continued and said that the Japanese government conducted a week-long deliberation, and then found out that about 2/3 of the information provided by Pyongyang was consistent with their own data. However, Chief Cabinet Secretary Yoshihide Suga said, "I'm not aware of the report, but nothing like that happened during the meeting or during a recess. It's sheer misreporting." When I first heard of the Nikkei report, I was really surprised because I personally don't believe that North Korea will present any, quote, survivors. It's not to their advantage. What's to their advantage is to keep Tokyo going through the motions. They've set up the review panel and gotten Tokyo to drop some sanctions. I still think it's very naive for Shinzo Abe to believe that Kim Jong-un is going to reveal some 400 Japanese citizens still living in Korea. I just don't see it happening. But what do you think? Are there Japanese citizens still alive in North Korea? Please leave your comments on our webpage, on Facebook, or Twitter. Those are all the stories for this week's episode, but before we close things out, let's hear a few of the comments that you left on last week's. First up, from Akashiko Kaze. So many simple-minded people from both Japan and Korea. They group each country as a whole instead of as individuals. They have all this built-up anger. Do these little things cause them that much anger that they hate an entire race? That is what you call racism. The governments of both Japan and Korea aren't helping in this matter. Davey So also spoke about Korea and Japanese relations in direct response to Akishiko Kaze. Japanese are against racism. We hate racism and Koreans. Is it contradiction? No. We have the justifiable reason to hate the country and the people. Racism is based on discrimination from ignorance or no ground. What we hope is to just break the relationship between the two countries. We don't need to get along with each other anymore. Before we move on, let me just editorialize for a moment. I personally find this a very hate-filled answer and extremely ignorant, and the viewpoints are expressed by only very few in Japan. As Kaze said, some people do lump individuals as the country rather than looking at the governments and their interactions in the region. In my travels around Korea and Japan, when people talk about hating one country or the other, when you dive deep into the information, it's usually about the governmental policies of the respective governments, and not the individual citizens. Okay, now back to the comments. Tuba Buddha shared his experiences with the supernatural after listening to our Asia Now story about ghosts in Seoul. On TV, I see images about something, and in my mind, I either see something upcoming as an image, or I just have the thought come to me of what will happen. As an example, I saw a cruise line commercial and saw, in a flash in my mind, that a ship would sink. I knew it was a cruise line, but saw either the Mediterranean or the Caribbean. It was the Costa Concordia. And finally, the alien had this to say about our Disabled in Japan story. When I came to Korea, my brain immediately focused on disability access. I found Korea to be lacking. The ramps were designed for delivery people, bringing boxes of supplies up a few steps. I've seen very few intentionally designed ramps for disabled people. I don't know if it would ever be possible, but I would love to have a meeting with an official in Korea about making the country more welcoming to disabled individuals, both tourists and homegrown, in time for the Olympics at a minimum of cost. And if any officials are listening, that person can be reached via Twitter at AlienReflection. That's just a small sampling of all the comments that were left last week, and I really do want to take a moment out to thank everyone who took the time to write those comments out. I do read each and every one and try to get back to everyone who left a comment, whether it be on YouTube, via Twitter, or our Facebook page, or even AsiaNewsWeekly.net. And again, thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much for sharing the show, both Asia Now and Asia News Weekly. It really does help the show grow, and I really do appreciate it. If you have any feedback about the show, what you like, what you don't, you can email me directly. podcast@AsiaNewsWeekly.net is the address. Well, that is it for this week's show, and for Asia News Weekly, I'm Steve Miller, reminding you to be true to yourself and always be awesome. Asia News Weekly is licensed under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial No Derivatives 4.0 International License.